Welcome to LiveDaf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom Aleichem and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos Daf with 2 lines from the top. Says the Gemara. V'chama. The Gemara here is referring back to the halacha in the Mishnah that if one was to go ahead and roast meat on Erev Shabbos very close to the onset of Shabbos, he must ensure that the meat is roasted before Shabbos, because otherwise he might be enticed to approach the oven, to stoke the flames, stir the coals, to hasten the roasting process. So the Mishnah says it needs to be roasted before Shabbos. V'chama. And how far roasted does it need to be? Does it need to be fully roasted? Is that necessary? Says the Gemara, no. It doesn't need to be fully roasted. Amar B'leza, Amar Rav, Kadei she'yitzoylu m'baydoim. It's okay, it's enough that it gets roasted on Erev Shabbos, k'machal ben dersoy, to the point of machal, the food of ben dersoy. He was a bandit, a robber who would eat his food when it was already 1/3 cooked. So evidently, it's already edible at that point, and it constitutes mevushal. It's considered to be cooked already or roasted, and this is sufficient to diminish this concern that the person will, out of desperation, go ahead and stoke the flames, stir the coals. So once he's gotten to the point of machal ben dersoy, he's roasted his meat up to the point of 1/3. At this point, it's already considered edible, and it is sufficient to remove the chashash of shami yechata. Itmar nami, we learned a similar halacha applying this concept of 1/3 cooked. Itmar nami, Amar V'asi, Amar Yechanan, kol shu k'machal ben dersoy. Once the food has been cooked up to this point of machal ben dersoy, it is considered to be edible and mevushal, and therefore ein boy mishum bishulei nachram. The halacha of bishulei nachram, that if a guy cooks food, it is also to be eaten. The Chacham made a gzeira for concern that it might lead to social interaction, and therefore, if the food has been already cooked up to the point of 1/3, it is sufficiently cooked, it has a din of mevushal, it is edible, and even if the non-Jew completes the cooking process, no harm is done. Tanya, says the Gemara, another halacha applying this principle. Chanan yoimer, kol shku machal ben dersoy. Once the food has reached this stage of machal ben dersoy, it has been cooked to 1/3. Mutar la'ashois al gab kira. One may leave it on top of a kira. This was a circular stove, and he may leave it on top of the kira throughout Shabbos. Va'afal b'shein grufa ketuma. Although the kira was not garaf katam, this is a requirement. Garaf is the shoveling of the coals. Ketuma is covering over the coals with ashes. So this is a requirement generally. If one would like to leave his pot on top of the stove throughout Shabbos, for concern that a person might approach the coals to stir them, and therefore one needs to shovel them or to cover them with ashes. However, if the food is already cooked up to the point of machal ben dersoy, it is already 1/3 cooked, it's already rendered edible, in that case a person may leave it on top of the kira. There's no concern of shami yechata b'gechalim. Continues the Gemara. What about baking bread on Erev Shabbos, close to the onset of Shabbos? Ein noisen es hapas, the Mishnah told us, unless there's enough time available for a crust to form on the bread. Iboilu. Reb Leza adds, he says, Kadei sheyikro ha'tachtin shelo. The bottom side of the dough, of the bread, needs to form a crust. What does it mean, tachtin? Iboilu. Now they used to paste the dough into this cove-shaped oven. So they used to paste it on the ceiling of the oven, and it was facing downward towards the flame, down on the floor. So when Rebbe Lezer says to the Tanakama that it's not sufficient for the crust to form, it needs to be the tachtin, the bottom side of the dough needs to form a crust. What does it mean by bottom? Tachtin, hayach de gabi taner. What does it mean? The bottom one, the bottom side, meaning the side of the dough that is pasted against the ceiling of the oven, that is tachtin. Oidilma tachtin, when he says tachtin, it means haich de gabi or. It means the exposed portion of the dough which is facing downward towards the flame. So what does Rebbe Lezer mean when he says tachtin? the crust needs to form on the tachton of the dough. Does it mean the bottom side, the side of the dough that is pasted up against the ceiling of the oven? Or does it mean the exposed portion of the dough, the surface that is facing downwards towards the flame? And it's much quicker. It's much harder. It takes much longer for the underside of the dough, which is away from the fire, to form a crust. It says the Gemara Tashma Reb Lezer Omer. We have a brayso where Reb Lezer says clearly, Kadei sheyikru paneh hamadubakim b'taner. When Reb Lezer says that a crust needs to form on the bottom side of the dough, what he means to say is the paneh, the side of the dough, which is medubakim b'taner, which is pasted against the oven. So Tosfos explains that Reb Lezer come to you machman Tanakama. He tells the Tanakama it's not sufficient for the dough to form a crust anywhere, whether on the exposed side or on the underside. We need the tachton. It needs to be on the underside of the dough, on the side of the dough which is pasted against the ceiling of the oven, which takes a bit longer to form than the crust on the other side. It continues the Gemara. Mishal Shalom Pesach. So the Mishnah told us there are some exceptions to this concern, to this gzera of Shem Yechata. For instance, regarding the Karban Pesach, they indeed are allowed to lower the spit with the Karban Pesach into the oven on Erev Shabbos, very close to nightfall, very close to Shabbos. There's no concern of Shem Yechata. My timer says, why? Mishum de Bnei Chabura Zrizenhen, because the group, the Chabura, which were involved in bringing the Karban Pesach, since they were involved in bringing a carbon, they were conscientious. They were mindful of what they were doing, and they will take care of each other and watch over one another so they don't come to do a malacha. Says the Gemara, halav hachi. But if not for this factor, that the Bnei Chabura has reason, halav hachi loy, it would be prohibited. V'amar mar, but haven't we learned? Gadya, when it's concerning the tender meat of a tender goat, in that case, there's no concern of Shem Yechata, because he won't open the oven door, since the inrush of cold air, the draft, will damage the tender meat. We learned Gadya, tender meat of a kid, ben sharik, whether or not the door to the oven is sealed shut, ben sharik, whether it's sealed, ben le sharik, whether it's not sealed, shaper dami. It is mutter for one to place this meat into the oven very close to Shabbos, because he will not come to open the door lest he damage the meat. Therefore, why, regarding a Karban Pesach, do you need another reason to be matter? Because Bnei Chabur is reason him. Regardless of that factor, the Karban Pesach was tender meat. It was brought from a goat or a sheep which was less than 1 year old. It was tender meat, delicate meat. In this case, there's no concern that one will open the door to the oven and stir the coals. Says the Gemara, there's a difference. Hasam, that halacha, is mintach, is only speaking about when the meat is cut into pieces. In that case, the Gemara tells us the inrush of cold air will ruin it, will harm it. And there's no chashash of Shem Yechata. He won't open the door to the oven. However, regarding Karban Pesach, we know it's loy mintach. It's not cut into pieces. We know the Karban Pesach was roasted in whole form. As the pasuk says, Roisha al krav al kirbay. In our case, there's no concern that the draft will harm the meat. If so, there is a very real chashash of Shem Yechata. It would be also, if not for the fact that Bnei Chabura, as rizim, they're conscientious and they'll watch one another not to come to do malacha. Continues the Gemara. What else did the Mishnah state as an exception for the Isser? That there is no Isser of Shem Yechata, there is no concern regarding the bonfire that they used to kindle in the Beis HaMoiked, Umachizin Asur, B'Meduras Beis HaMoiked. They would kindle the bonfire in the Beis HaMoiked, which was in the Beis HaMikdash, for the sake of the Kehanim, to warm them up. And one may even begin kindling it very close to Shabbos. There's no concern that somebody will go ahead and approach the coals and stir them to improve the performance of the flame. Says, well, what is the reason for this heter? Menan Amili, how do we know this heter? Amar Avuna, it's actually a pasuk. It says, like Sivaru Eish, don't kindle a fire. B'chol Moshe Sechem, in all your dwellings, B'yom Shabbos. What does the pasuk mean with the term B'chol Moshe Sechem? Pasuk is teaching us something. That only B'chol Moshe Sechem, in all your private dwellings, Yatamaver, may you not kindle a fire. Aval but atomaver, you may light a fire in Meduras Beis HaMikdash. In the Medura, the bonfire in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, certainly it's mutter for them to kindle this fire in Erev Shabbos close to Shabbos, because even if they're going to actually stir the coals on Shabbos, it would be mutter. The pasuk tells us it's mutter. Maskler chizda. If so, that the pasuk teaches us a heter that one is allowed to kindle the Meduras Beis HaMikdash even on Shabbos. So even to kindle it anew on Shabbos itself, it's mutter. So why does the Mishnah need to tell us a halacha that the Kohanim may kindle the bonfire on Erev Shabbos, although it's very close to the onset of Shabbos? We're not concerned that they'll do any malach on Shabbos. Even on Shabbos itself, they may kindle the fire. So it's unrelated with this concept of the Gzeir Shemichata. It's a blanket heter. They may light a fire on Shabbos itself. Ela Rav Chizda cannot be so. The pasuk is not referring to this type of case. Ela Rav Chizda kra ki asa. What is the pasuk coming to teach us? The pasuk which says that only in all your dwellings you may not light a fire, but otherwise you may. The pasuk is referring to a specific case, to karbanis ki aser lemishri. The pasuk is coming to be matir a case of a varim upedarim hudasa, a case of burning the varim, the parts of the karbanis upedarim, the fats, which were left over from the weekday karbanis, which were left over from the Friday karban. The pasuk teaches us one may complete the burning of the varim upedarim even on Shabbos. That's only because we're speaking about the actual offering of the karbanis, but certainly the bonfire which the Kohanim made for their own convenience, for private use, which was unrelated to karbanis, made it in the Beis HaMikdash to warm them up. Rashi explains, since they used to walk barefoot on the floor of the Azara, this was a requirement. Since the floor of the Azara is kodesh and they need to be directly connected to it without any chatzitzes, so they needed the fire to warm them up. This was a private matter. This wasn't actually a carbon. Therefore, certainly one may not kindle the bonfire for the Meduras Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos itself. The pasuk is speaking about karbanis, the varim upedarim, the remnants of the karbanis. So what then is the heter cited in our Mishnah regarding the Meduras Beis HaMikdash? It's only regarding Erev Shabbos. One may begin the kindling this bonfire in Erev Shabbos, even though it's very close to the onset of Shabbos. Nevertheless, we're not concerned that perhaps one of the Kohanim will go ahead and meddle with the fire on Shabbos. Why? The Kohanim is reasoning because the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash were involved in bringing the karbanos. They indeed were bnei Torah. They were conscientious and mindful of what they were doing, and there's no concern that one of them might come to do malacha on Shabbos. Now, Tosfos points out that when the pasuk tells us, when the Gemara tells us that one may complete the burning of the varim upedarim even on Shabbos, says Tosfos, how can it be so? We know that one may not burn the varim upedarim of the weekday karbanos, of a carbon that was already offered on Friday. One may not take the ivarim and the pedarim and burn it on Shabbos. So what is the Gemara speaking about? Says Tosfos, the Gemara is speaking about when they were already ignited by the fire. It was mashla, but in ha'ur, that the fire has already caught onto them. They're already partially burnt. So once they've gotten to that stage, that advanced stage of akrava, says Tosfos, so even if they're part of the weekday karbanos, the karbanos shall chayil, nevertheless, since they've come to that advanced stage of akrava, it was mashla ben ha'ur. Therefore, the pasuk is teaching us that one may complete their akrava even on Shabbos itself. So, in summation, the Mishnah tells us that there are certain cases which the Gzeir of Shemichata will not apply. The Mishnah begins by telling us that if one roasts meat, if the meat is roasted already on Erev Shabbos, he may continue this process. It may continue. It may remain in the oven and continue its roasting on Shabbos. The Gemara explains it doesn't need to be fully roasted as long as it's shlish, it's roasted or cooked a third. It's considered to be mavushal, it's considered to be tzolei. It is somewhat edible, and therefore there's no concern that he'll go out of desperation to hasten the cooking and roasting process. The Gemara said that this halacha, this principle of being cooked a third, is called machal ben dersoy. This was the manner in which this bandit would eat his food, and this applies to three things. Number one, to Shabbos, as we mentioned here. Number two, to bishul akum. If it's already a third cooked, it's considered to be properly cooked and edible somewhat. And there's din mavushal, and even if the guy will complete the bishul, It does not do any harm. Also regarding Shabbos, that when we place this type of food on top of a kira, even though the coals are present, they are not shoveled or covered by ash, which is generally a requirement for one if he wants to leave something on top of the kira over Shabbos. In this case, that it's already somewhat edible, there's no chashash of Shem Yechat. What about bread? So there's a machlekes. The Tanna Kama says that as long as any surface of the dough has formed a crust, it's considered to be sufficient to remove the chashash of Shem Yechat. Rabbi Lezer says it needs to be the paneh tachten, the bottom side of the dough, which is attached to the oven, that needs to form a crust, and that's later. So he's being machmer over the Tanna Kama. The Gemara told us regarding two exceptions to this Isser. Number one, the Korban Pesach. That may be done even very close to Shabbos. Since the Bnei Chabura's reason, they'll pay attention, they'll watch each other, they don't come to do malacha. The Kohanim as well in the Beis HaMikdash, even though it's a private bonfire, it's not part of the Akrava. It's mutar. Kohanim's reason him. They're conscientious and mindful, and they won't come to do malacha on Shabbos. Continues the Gemara. Ubegvulin, however, a bonfire which is lit outside the Beis HaMikdash, it requires that the fire should catch on to most of it. At that point, it's considered to be sufficiently developed and will certainly proceed on its own without any interference. There's no chashash. Somebody will go ahead and stoke the flames, stir the coals to develop the fire further. Says the Gemara, okay, what does it mean? That the fire needs to catch on berubai, on the majority, on most of it. What does it mean the most of what? We're speaking about a bunch of pieces of wood. My ruban, what does it mean most of it? Amarav, roiv kelechav le'echad. If you have a bunch of pieces of wood, we require that the fire catches on to most of each single piece of wood. Now we're not speaking about the interior, the thickness of the wood. We're not speaking about the circumference of the wood. It is sufficient that most of the length has caught fire. Because since they're lying together as a group, one will kindle the other, the fire will catch from one to the next, and it is considered to be sufficiently developed to mitigate the chashash, the concern, that somebody will go ahead and stoke the flames. Ushmuel Amar, it's not required. We don't require that much development. It is enough kadesha lo yoimru, that the fire has gotten to the stage and point that one will not say any longer, come bring some small pieces of wood to place underneath the large logs to kindle them. So once it has gotten to that point, that one doesn't need to aid and assist the fire, doesn't need to bring little splinters to help in the kindling of the fire. Apparently, the fire is sufficiently developed to the point that we are sure that it will continue developing on its own, and will not require anybody to go and meddle with it and tinker with it on Shabbos. So Shmuel is being makel, is more lenient than Rav. We don't need a roiv. It is enough that it got to the point that one lays back and doesn't go ahead and add little pieces of splinters to help in the kindling. Tani Rav Chiya l'siyud Shmuel. Rav Chiya has a brisa in support of this concept stated by Shmuel. This brisa is regarding the avodah of Halogas HaMenorah in the Beis HaMikdash, and the brisa tells us that the kohen needs to kindle the menorah up to the point kedei shetehei shalheves, that the flame needs to be developed enough that the flame will be will rise on its own without any additional assistance, and that is considered to be properly lit. But it's not sufficient that he merely kindles it a bit, that the flame still needs some help, some assistance to rise up. So apparently, what constitutes the status of being lit? It is once the flame has gotten to the point that it rises on its own without any help, without any assistance. Here too, regarding the bonfire, what is considered to be a properly developed fire, once it's gotten to the point that it doesn't need to be assisted by bringing some splinters of wood and helping in the kindling. So this is in accordance with the Shita of Shmuel. So we discussed a fire which is based on a bunch of pieces of wood. Rav says we need most of each piece. Shmuel says as long as it doesn't need any more assistance. What about a bonfire in which you take one single stump of wood and you light it? This is a little bit more complicated because you don't have the bunch of wood which is all the pieces of wood which help each other and aid and assist in the kindling. We have one single stump of wood. If so, we have one machmer in this case. Says the Gemara, eitz yechidi, if it's a single stump of wood, what is considered to be the point of shetechos ha'ur berubai? The fire has caught on to most of it. Says the Gemara, we have another machlekes. Rav Amar, Rav Avyai. The fire needs to reach most of its interior, most of its thickness. At that point, the fire has developed to the point that we are sure that it will be successful on its own and won't require any more tinkering. V'amila, some say, there's a girsa, Ushmol Amar, B'roiv HaKefai. That roiv here is not the thickness, but rather the circumference. When the fire surrounds most of the block of wood, that is sufficient, and that at that point, one may leave it over Shabbos. There's no concern of Shamiyachat. So Rav says most of the thickness, and the Shmuel says most of the circumference. Amar Papa, if we have two opinions, let's combine it. Hilkach, therefore, be'ina and Rav Avyai, or be'ina Rav Kefai. Rav Papa says, let's be machmer, let's combine both opinions. Both are required. Most of the thickness, as well as most of the circumference. The Gilyon Shas points out that this was Rav Papa's practice. Several times in Shas, we find that he would combine two shitos. We had this in Brachas Naflan Tes. We combined two different opinions into one and required both of them to be fulfilled. Says Market Tanai, indeed this dispute of Rav Avya and Rav Kefai is actually also connected to the Machlekes Tanaim that we find. Rav Chia Amar, we require that the wood become damaged and destroyed and unfit to be used by the craftsman. Rashi explains, this is Rav Avyai, when it got to the point that most of its thickness was already burnt. So now it's unfit for craft. Yehuda Reimer was speaking about Rav HaKefai, when the fire catches on both sides. So we don't need Rav HaKefai, but rather Rav Avyai, rather we need Rav HaKefai. Even though we don't have a proof to this concept, we have an indication to this, that once the fire has surrounded most of the wood, it's considered to be a fully developed fire. The pasuk says that the two sides the fire has caught on, and the inside became fully dried out. Will indeed this log be suitable for craft? So apparently, the pasuk is indicating that once the fire has surrounded the piece of wood, then its entire inside has become dried out, and surely the fire will carry on and carry through and continue burning successfully. As Taisvis, the pasuk here says that when the fire caught onto both sides of the log, it's not fit. It's unfit for malacha. Now the Gemara before told us that this description of the eights becoming unfit for craft is specifically regarding a piece of wood where the fire has permeated its interior, has burned through most of its thickness. As the Gemara said before, Reb Chia says that the eights becomes unfit for craft when the fire permeates most of its interior. And here the pasuk describes the fire merely surrounding the exterior of the wood, and that results in becoming unfit for craft. How do these two things work? Says Tosfos, generally speaking, in order for it to be unfit for craft, indeed the interior needs to get burnt. This pasuk is speaking about Eitz Hagefen, the wood of a vine tree, which is more susceptible and apparently more delicate. So even when it's merely Rav HaKefai, the fire merely surrounds it, that already results in the piece of wood becoming unfit to use for craft. So in summation, the Mishnah taught us that one may light a bonfire on Erev Shabbos very close to Shabbos, as long as the fire took hold of most of the material. It caught on to rubai, shatecha za'ur berubai. Now what does it mean, ha'ur berubai? The majority of what? So it depends what type of bonfire we're speaking about. If we're speaking about a pile of wood, then we have a machlekes between Rav and Shmuel. Rav says it requires roiv shekol echad ve'echad, most of the length of each individual piece of wood. Shmuel says that's not necessary, as long as the fire has proceeded sufficiently that one doesn't call out to bring forth some splinters to help in the kindling of the fire. So at that point, it has developed sufficiently to the point that we're confident that the fire will develop and proceed unhindered without any need for interference. The Gemara compares this to the mitzvah of menorah. It's considered to be in the state of a lit once the shalevis, once the flame rises up on its own without any additional help or assistance. Now if the fire is burning in eitz yechidi, a single log, a single stump of wood, in that case, Rav says, we need roiv avyoy, that the fire has reached the majority, most of its thickness. It permeated into roiv of its thickness. Shmuel says roiv kefoy, most of its circumference. Rav Papa says we're going to combine both shitas and be stringent. We require both roiv avyoy as well as roiv kefoy. Continues the Gemara with a somewhat related machlekes regarding a pasuk. The pasuk says va'ach lefanav mevayores. So the ach was in front of it and burning. Rashi says this is describing Yoakim HaMelech, who was burning the Megillah, the scroll sent him by Yirmiyah, which foretold the upcoming Churban. So he was burning it. He wanted to disregard the message. Now what is the definition of the word ha'ach? My ach. Amar Rav Achvana, these are branches of a willow tree. Ushmol Amar, ach is the same as brother. Eitim shenidliku b'achvana, a pile of wood that burn in brotherhood. It's a pile of wood of various sizes, and each one kindles the other. They burn together in brotherhood. Says the Gemara, Yehuda Amalu, somebody was announcing, my boy Achvana, who wants to buy Achvana. And what did they find? Ishtakach Arvasa, he was holding on to willow branches. So apparently, Achvana refers to willows. Okay, continues the Gemara. The Mishnah taught us that a medura can only be lit on Erev Shabbos if the fire is oiches berubai, catches on to most of it. Says the Gemara, there are some exceptions to this rule. Some fuels, some materials are highly combustible, highly flammable. And in those cases, we're not concerned about Shem Yechata, because once you ignite them, we are certain that the fire will develop properly and complete on its own. It won't need any additional tinkering, any additional interference. Therefore, even if he merely lights it, just a little bit of it, on Erev Shabbos, that is enough, and is mutter to do so even very close to Shabbos. So what are these materials? Says the Gemara, Amar Fun, Konim, reeds, they are highly combustible, and Eitzrichim roiv, they don't need a roiv. So if they're loose reeds, a roiv is not required. However, Ogdan, if they're bundled together, in this case the fire has difficulty traveling between them. Tzrichim roiv, we require a roiv, that the fire catches on to most of it before Shabbos. A similar halacha regarding Garinim, date pits. Ain't tzrichim roiv, roiv is not required if they're loose. But nasam b'chasalas, if they heap together and the baskets made of these branches, so since they're bunched together, the fire has some difficulty traveling between them. And indeed, tzrichim roiv, we require a roiv that the fire catches on to most of it while it is still Erev Shabbos. So once again, Rav Huna says loose items are more susceptible to the fire than items that are heaped together. Masculine Chizr challenges this assertion. Ha'adar, just the opposite. If Chamastav logic indicates otherwise. If they're loose, they might get dispersed, and the fire will not catch one from the other. Ogdan, however, if they're bundled together, they don't get dispersed, and in that case, there's more of a chance of the fire spreading properly. The same thing regarding the pits, Garinim. If they're loose pits, Mevadron, there's a concern that they get dispersed, and the fire won't catch properly. But if they're heaped together in these baskets, they don't get dispersed, and the fire will proceed more successfully. It Menami says Rav Kana will take the middle route with regarding the reeds. He's going to follow the opinion of Rav Huna. that loose reeds are better than ones that are bundled together. Regarding pits, he's going to assume the opinion of Chizah. Let's see inside. If the reeds are bundled together, indeed, fire will have some difficulty traveling between them. A roiv is required. If they're really loose, a roiv is not required. Regarding the pits, it's just the opposite. If they're loose, in this case, they're heaped together and they're more susceptible to the fire. A roiv is not required in accordance with the shita of Rav Chizah. To Rav Yosef, there are more materials that are considered to be highly flammable, and merely igniting them is considered to be sufficient to ensure success, eventual success of the bonfire. To Rav Yosef, arba maduris, 4 types of fires don't require a roiv. Shal zefes, of pitch, shal gafres, of sulfur, shal gvina, of cheese, shal ravav, of fats. Masisatana, in the Maisa we added another couple, av shal kash, straw of shal gvava, the remnants of the stalks in the field and the splinters of wood that are gathered from the field. So these are highly combustible, flammable items. There's no concern of Shem Yichat, as long as he lit a little bit, we're sure the fire will proceed successfully. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, eitzim shal bavel, eitzim from Bavel, Babylonian wood, they too are highly combustible, ein tzrichen roiv. Maskar of Yosef, what are you referring to when you say eitzim shal bavel? Mai, what exactly is this? Ilay Mesilti was speaking about these small chips of wood. They used to do that in Bavel. They used to chop the wood into small chips, and that doesn't need roiv. That is highly combustible. Hashta, if we find psila regarding a oil-soaked wick, Amar Ula, Ula said, Hamadik, one who lights the Neira Shabbos, he must stay there and light most of the wick which is protruding from the oil. So there's a requirement to burn it, to light it, up to the point that most of the wick is lit. Only by doing so has he fulfilled his mitzvah of Ner Shabbos. So an oil-soaked wick, which is certainly more flammable than wood chips, if that requires one to stand there and light most of it, siltimi, but certainly chips of wood require roiv to be considered to be in the status of lit, of properly lit. So you can't say that silty chips of wood don't require roiv. Elam Rav Yosef, what are we speaking about? Shucha da'arza, this woolly substance that is found in the branches of the cedar tree. So this indeed is very flammable, and roiv is not required. Rami bar Abba Omar, it's referring to zaza, this type of moss, which indeed is also highly flammable, and therefore in these cases, once he even lit a little bit of it, is sufficient for the success of the eventual fire, and there's no concern about Shema Yechat. So in summary, we learned about a list of items which do not have the stipulation of roiv. By merely igniting it somewhat on Erev Shabbos, it is very mutter to maintain this fire in Shabbos, because we're certain that the fire will catch on properly and will proceed successfully without any tinkering or interference. What are these items? So we began with kanim and garinim, reeds and pits, date pits. However, machlekes, in what configuration is a mutter? Rav Huna says the kanim and garinim that are loose, that are not bundled together, they are susceptible to the fire and don't require roiv. Rav Chizah says only if they're bundled together. Rav Kahana says kanim that are loose are indeed susceptible to the fire. Garinim, they need to be heaped together in order for the requirement of roiv to be cancelled on them. So according to Rav Huna, kanim and garinim required to be loose. According to Rav Chizah, required to be bundled. According to Rav Kahana, the kanim required to be loose, and garinim are required to be bundled. The Gemara proceeded with many other examples of items that are highly flammable and combustible. For instance, zephes, the pitch, gofres, sulfur, gvina, cheese, revav, fats, kash and gvava, straw, and the stubble of the field, shucha da'arza, the woolly material found inside the cedar branch, and finally zaza, this type of moss. Hadran alach yitzia is hashabbos. Continues the Mishnah, ba'meh madlikin u'ba'meh ein madlikin. What types of materials can be used as fuel and wicks for Neir Shabbos, and what types of materials are possible disqualified for Neir Shabbos. Now we know the Chacham gave us a mitzvah. Havad Lakas Neir Shabbos, one's meant to light a candle, a lamp, before Shabbos. There are various reasons for this mitzvah. Oinek Shabbos, Kavod Shabbos, Shalom Bayis. Oinek Shabbos means so that the Shabbos meal should take place in front of a light. This enhances the mealtime experience. One enjoys his food more when he can see what he's eating. Having a lit lamp is also a Kavod Shabbos, a mark of honor for the sake of Shabbos. It also enhances the peace and harmony in the home, since one won't trip over unforeseen objects lying on the floor. So the Mishnah goes and teaches us that the Neir Shabbos needs to be lit in a manner where the flame is a steady, healthy flame, and there's no concern that it will falter and it will require some aid and assistance. The person will go ahead and adjust it on Shabbos. That's a malacha. Therefore, one must use proper materials, wicks, to have the ability to absorb fuel properly, have the ability to maintain a steady, healthy flame. One must use fuels that have the ability to absorb properly inside the wicks and produce a steady flame. Says the Mishnah, what types of wicks, what type of materials can we use for wick in the Neir Shabbos? What materials are disqualified from being used as psiles, as wicks, for the Neir Shabbos? Says the Mishnah, we may not use loy belechash, this woolly substance found in the cedar branches mentioned earlier in the Gemara. V'loy b'choisen, a wick made of unprocessed flax. V'loy b'cholach, a wick made from this low-grade silk, the cocoon of the worm. V'loy b'psila se'idan, one cannot make a wick from the psila se'idan. This was the woolly material found inside the willows. V'loy b'psila samidbar, or to use this tall grass found in the desert, which was braided into wicks. V'loy b'yoreika shal pnei hamayim, or this green substance which is found on the surface of the water. So up until this point we discussed limitations regarding wicks. These things don't have the ability to produce a steady, healthy flame. The Mishnah will proceed listing for us disqualified fuels because they don't have the ability to be absorbed properly in the wick and to produce a healthy flame. What are these wicks, these fuels? V'loy b'zefes. You can't use pitch, v'loy b'shava, wax, v'loy b'shemen kik. According to one pshat in the Gemara, it's the oil from a specific type of bird. V'loy b'shemen sreifa. This is true that became tumah, needs to be burnt. V'loy b'alya. Can I use fat from the tail of a sheep? V'loy b'chelef. Nor can we use fat tissue from an animal. We can use chelev, which was cooked, which is in a liquefied form. Regardless, it is possible. Whether it's cooked, or uncooked, continues the Gemara will describe for us to define a definition of the various items mentioned in the Mishnah. We began with lechesh. What is lechesh? Shucha d'arza, a branch of a cedar tree. Says the Gemara, shucha d'arza. It's ba'almo, it's a piece of wood. It's not suitable to make a wick from it. So perhaps you can use it for a torch, but not for a wick. So why does the Mishnah need to mention this? Says the Gemara, it's ba'almo, it's merely a piece of wood. But amernisa the ispe, we're speaking about the amernisa, the woolly substance found inside, behind the bark, and that indeed can be formed into a wick. Nevertheless, it's unsuitable for Ner Shabbos. V'lei b'choisen. What is choisen? Rav Yosef Noris or Pishtan. These broken fibers of flax which are found inside the flax plant. And this is the choisen referred to in the Mishnah. Amli Abaye. You can't propose that Noiris and choisen are the same item, because the pasuk seems to differentiate between the two. V'ksiv doesn't it say V'ya chasen l'Noiris? The strong one will be weak like Noiris. So Abaye interprets the word chosen like choisen, and he infers from this pasuk Michlal. Apparently, the chosen lav Noirisu, they're two separate items. So you can't say that they are one and the same. Ela Abaye, what then is chosen, which is described in our Mishnah? It is kisna flax, the daik which was crushed. So they used to soak it and crush it, and then they used to separate the fibers one from the other. So this flax only underwent a partial processing. It was the daik was crushed, but it wasn't yet separated. The fibers weren't really separated, and therefore, since it isn't fully processed, it has some difficulty absorbing the fuel properly, and it can't be used for a wick for Ner Shabbos. What is that? Amar Shmuel Shaltinu, I asked all the seafarers, what exactly is this? And they told me, Kol Chashmei. It's this mossy substance which grows on top of stones at sea. Rav Yitzchak Aziri Amar, Gushkura, it's the psoilis, it's the low-grade silk, the cocoons of the worms, which are formed into psilois, and they're not capable of maintaining a steady, healthy flame. Says the Gemara story, Ravin v'Abaye, Havayos v'Kamedu was sitting in front of Ravana Nachemya, who was the brother, Achbad Reish Galusa, the brother of the head of the Galus. Chazi, they noticed that Havalavish Metak, so he was wearing this unique garment made of silk. Amarli Ravin Abaye, Hainu Kalach Desnan, we have a live demonstration of the Kalach material discussed in our Mishnah. This beged consists of Kalach. Amarli, so Abaye told him, no, it's unrelated. This is not Kalach. Anan, we, Shira Paran Makarinale. This material that he's wearing, we call it with the name Shira Paradna, which is high-grade silk. This is not the Kalach mentioned in our Mishnah, which is low-grade silk. They're unrelated. Says Gemara Meisvei, we have a brisa which seems to contradict Ravin's assertion that ordinary silk is considered to be Kalach. The brisa says Hashirayim silk, V'akalach. V'asirikin, Chayav B'tzitzis. The brisa gives us three types of silk. They're all Chayav and Tzitzis. Rashi explains that the brisa here is coming to rule out from the Shita that holds that only begadim made of wool and linen, Samar Pishtam, Chayav and Tzitzis. No, the brisa tells us all types of materials obligated in Tzitzis. In any case, the brisa lists three different types of silk. Shirayim, which is ordinary silk, V'akalach, which seems to be a different types of silk. So apparently, the beged that this fellow was wearing, which was ordinary silk, or even high-grade silk, can't be considered to be kalach. The brisa seems to put them in two different categories. There's shirayim and there's kalach. So this is a kasha to Ravin, who says that shirayim and kalach are one and the same. Tiyufta de Ravin tiyufta. So indeed, this is a refutation to Ravin's pshat. Shirayim is considered to be ordinary silk, and kalach must be low-grade silk, and that is what's mentioned in our Mishnah. Or we have another teretz, Shira L'chud v'Shira Faradin L'chud, that Ravin will maintain that Kalach mentioned in our Mishnah is actually high-grade silk. The Shira Paradna that this person was wearing, this garment of Ravana Nechemya, consisted of a high-grade silk called Shira Paradna. According to Ravin, this indeed is the kalach mentioned in our Mishnah. Getting back to the brisa says shirayim v'akalach, which seems to separate between shirayim and kalach. Pashat, simple, because the brisa is speaking about ordinary silk. Shirayim means standard silk. V'akalach is this high-grade silk, this shira paradna, which is the material that this person was wearing, which indeed is the kalach of our Mishnah. So there's no kasha from the brisa. When the brisa separates between shirayim and kalach, it's very, very much understood why. Because shirayim and kalach are two separate things. Shirayim is ordinary silk and kalach is high-grade silk. So in summary, the Mishnah tells us that kalach is disqualified from being used as a wick for Ner Shabbos. What is kalach? So we have several pshatim. According to Shmuel, it's this mossy substance which grows on the stone at sea. According to Rav Yitzchak Bazira, it's the psoilis of the meshi. It's the low-grade silk made of the cocoon of the worm. And according to Ravin, in the final pshat in the Gemara, in the Bayisema, kalach is actually the high-grade silk, the shir paradna, and that is disqualified from being used for Ner Shabbos. Continues the Gemara, what is that? Achmina, the woolly substance found in the willows. Says the Gemara story, Ravin v'Abaye, they were traveling with Paksa in this valley, the Tamrisa valley. Chazinu lahana arbasa. So they noticed those willows. Amalei Ravin Abaye. So just as in the earlier story, Ravin exclaimed to Abaye, look, take a look. We have a live demonstration of the halacha in our Mishnah. Hainu idan desnan. This exactly is the idan described in our Mishnah. Amalei, Abai responded, Hayetz ba'almu. You're looking at a wood, at a tree. That can't be used for a wick. Kala v'achlei, so Ravin peeled away the bark and he showed it v'achlei amernisa, the woolly substance, the beni that's found in between, and that indeed is the idan described in our Mishnah, the woolly substance found inside the willow tree. What is that? That is shavra, some sort of tall grass, which grows in the desert, which can be braided into a wick. The green substance found on top of the water. What is that? The charitzi, this green algae that grows on top of the water of the ditches. That substance merely crumbles into crumbs. That certainly can't be used for a wick. Papa was speaking about the green substance which grows, the moss which gathers underneath the hull of a moored ship. Tana, we have a brisa which added to the Mishnah. Hayisifa alain, they added another two substances which are disqualified from being used as wicks. Shal tzemer, wicks made of wool, but shal seir, made of hair. Says more, if so, why didn't our Mishnah mention these items? If Tana did done, our Tana didn't find any need to discuss wool or hair. Why? Because these things are inherently incapable of being used as a wick. Tzemer, michvetz chavitz. Tzemer, wool curls up and is not suitable, cannot function as a wick regardless. Seir, hair, it gets incinerated by the fire immediately. So these things are inherently incapable of carrying a flame. They're unsuitable inherently to be used as a wick, and therefore there's no need to discuss these in the Mishnah. Continues the Gemara regarding fuels that are disqualified. What is zephes? Zifsa, pitch, shavas, kirusa, wax. Tana, says the Gemara, we learned in the Brisa, Adkan, up until the zephes and the shava, the items mentioned up until now, that was regarding psul psiles, disqualified wicks, mekan ve'elach. From here on in, going forward, psul shmana. The list consists of disqualified fuels. It says more pshita. It's self-evident that zephes and shava are fuels. Why do you need to stipulate and explain to me that the category of disqualified fuels begin from here? It's pashut. Says more shavetz tzichle. The Brisa needs to inform us regarding wax and tell us that it is only disqualified to be used as a fuel. Perhaps I would think that cannot be used as a wick. For instance, Rashi says they used to form the wax into candles. So even though it's not being used as a fuel, it's being used in wick form, I would think perhaps it's not suitable in that scenario as well. Perhaps I would think not only can it be used as a wick, if you drop a piece of wax into the candle, is it unsuitable? But even lepsilis nami lechaz, even if it would be used as a wick in a candle form, kamashmon, that's what the Brisa needs to teach us. No, that from here on in, going forward, zephes and shava are merely speaking about disqualified fuels. But if it was to form the shava into a wick, like a candle, certainly it is mutter. Continues the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Bar Abin, Itrina, what is the substance called Itrina? Itron is psulta de zifsa, the remnants of pitch. It's a byproduct of the processing of the pitch. Shava, what is shava? Psulta de dufsha, the remnants of the honey. So what remains of the honeycomb once they extract the honey. It says more l'maynaf gemina. Is there any halachic ramification to this discussion of the itra being pselos zephes, of the shava being the pselos of the dvash? It says more, yes, there is a halachic manifestation to this discussion. L'mekach l'memker, for buying and selling. So if a person commits to selling his friend some itron, he need only give him this byproduct of pitch. He doesn't need to process it any further. Same thing regarding wax. If he tells him he's going to sell him shava, he need only give him this crushed honeycomb. He doesn't need to process it any further. That is considered to be shava. Let's take perhaps a quick review of today's daf. Beginning from the beginning, we discussed the Gzer Shem Yechata, and we know that there's no gzera in the following situations. It is mutter to begin a cooking process, provided that there is some cooking that took place already in Beit Yoim. The Gemara told us what is the degree of cooking, what is the degree of roasting required. It needs to be at least a shlish, gotten to a stage of a third of its ordinary cooking, ordinary roasting. That is considered to be mavushal etzali. It's considered to be somewhat arable. It is machal ben dersoy, like the bandit ben dersoy used to cook its food, and therefore it is sufficient to mitigate the chashash of shamichate. One will not be inclined to go ahead and meddle and interfere with the cooking process since it's already reached an edible stage. The Gemara told us this principle applies to three things: Shabbos, bishul akum. If a guy completes the cooking process after it has already been cooked a third, he doesn't do any harm. When we place a food which is cooked a third on top of a kira, he need not worry about the coals, even though he didn't scoop away the coals or cover them. That's okay, because once it's reached a third of its cooking, it's considered to be somewhat edible, and there's no chashash of shami yechata. Regarding bread, we require that it formed a crust. Sheikru panel. Rabbi Lezer says it needs to be the bottom side, the underside of the dough, and the Gemara concludes it means the side that is attached to the oven. The Gemara told us that regarding our Karban Pesach, there's never a chashash that will do malacha because Bnei Chabur is reason him. Kohanim Beis Hamikdash as well, there is reason him. Therefore, there's never a chashash of shami yechata. The Mishnah told us that regarding a bonfire, we require shatecha za'ur berubai. The fire has caught on to most of it. What does it mean, most of it? So if we're speaking about a pile of wood, according to Rav, we need roiv shekol echad ve'echad. Most of each piece of wood, according to Shmuel, the fire needs to have gotten to the stage of development that one doesn't call out and look for more spindles of wood to go ahead and aid in the kindling of the fire. The Gemara compared it to the halach of menorah. Once the flame rises up on its own, unassisted, is considered to be sufficiently developed and has the status of being lit. Regarding an etzichidi, a single stump, a log of wood, Rav says we require rev avyai. The fire has permeated most of its interior, most of its thickness. According to Shmuel, rev kefai, most of its circumference. Rav Papa's machmer. We require both rev avyai and rev kefai. The more proceeded and told us there's some things that are combustible, highly flammable, and don't need a rev, even if he merely ignites it somewhat. We are confident that the fire will proceed and catch on properly. What are these materials? The Gemara began with kanim and garinim, reeds and pits, according to Rav Huna. If they're loose, then rev is not required, according to Rav Chizder. If they're bundled together, in that case, rev is not required, according to Rav Kahana. It depends. Kanim, when they're loose. Garinim, the pits of dates, when they're heaped together, in that case, they don't require rev. Once he kindles them somewhat, we're sure, confident that the fire will catch on properly and develop on its own without any need for interference. The Gemara concluded with other materials as well that are highly combustible. Zephes, pitch, gopher, sulfur, cheese, revav is the fats, kash, straw, gvava, the remnants of the stalks in the field with the different splinters of wood which are gathered from the field. Shucha de arza, the woolly material found inside the cedar branch, and finally zaza, this moss material. Since these things are highly flammable, there's no chashash of shami yechata. Once you kindle them somewhat, the fire will catch on and develop properly. The Gemara proceeded with the next parak that the mitzvah ner Shabbos is to light the lamp before Shabbos, provided that the materials allow and maintain a properly burning flame, a steady flame, which will mitigate the chashash of shema. Perhaps he will go ahead and adjust and brighten the flame, so you must use proper materials for wicks as well as fuels. You may not use materials that can't properly hold the flame, regardless whether we're speaking about the wicks that can't properly absorb the fuels and can't maintain a steady flame, or various fuel materials that aren't successfully absorbed inside the wicks and don't maintain a healthy, steady flame. The Gemara concluded that regarding shava, wax, it is only a psul with regard to fuel, but if you were to form the wax into a wick, for instance, in a candle form, that certainly is permitted. That maintains a clear, healthy, and steady flame.